On this occasion of Christmas, I thought I might do something a little bit different and a little bit offbeat in a certain sense. I want to do an extended reflection on this movie called The Terminal, starring Tom Hanks and directed by Steven Spielberg, which came out in 2004. Now, in terms of the actual plot, it's based loosely on this true story, but suffice to say that Tom Hanks plays this guy named Victor Dvorsky. And so basically, as a matter of background, a long time ago, Victor's father saw this photograph in this newspaper of various famous jazz musicians. And he got this idea at the back of his mind that he wanted to get the signatures of all these different musicians. And he managed to do so for the most part, except for one. And then he died. So basically now, in the context of the current film, Victor Dvorsky is trying to go to New York to acquire this last signature of this jazz musician named Benny Colson, who is playing at this jazz bar at the Ramada Inn in the context of New York City. The only difficulty, though, is that before he arrives at JFK Airport in New York, basically his country, Krakosia, is subject to this military coup, as a result of which it loses diplomatic status in the eyes of the United States. And so basically what happens is that Victor Dvorsky is kind of caught in this technical loophole, as a result of which he can't go back to Krakosia, nor can he enter the United States of America. And so basically what happens is that he's basically forced to live in the International Airport Lounge of JFK for several months. And that's basically the essential plot of the film. Now, even when you hear that basic premise, you might imagine quite rightly that a lot of really funny scenarios arise. And so, yeah, especially early on in the film, you see a lot of funny scenarios where Victor Dvorsky is walking around the airport wearing his bathrobe, he's trying to take a shower using the airport sink, and on top of that, there's all sorts of different scenarios where he has really awkward conversations, especially with the airport staff, because English is his second language and he has sort of a funny accent. Now, I have to admit, I saw this movie a long time ago when I was in law school, and if you were to ask me shortly after having seen this movie, what'd you think? I would have said I liked it, and that it was a funny, kind of entertaining movie, but that's pretty much it. So when I saw it again later on after becoming a priest, something which really struck me, which to this day I'm kind of embarrassed that I kind of missed, was the emotional resonance of the film. And so yeah, there's a lot of funny scenes, not unlike the ones I just cited, but at the same time, at the heart of the film is a tragedy, something which is meant to really strike one's heart at the core. And so even at the very beginning of the film, when the airport authorities are trying to explain to Victor Dvorsky about this really complicated situation affecting his home country, they're not even really trying that hard, right? And so here's this guy who, again, doesn't really speak English. They gave him some food vouchers, a calling card, a pager, just in case they need to contact him. And that's pretty much it. And they know, if you read between the lines, that he just doesn't understand. And then all of a sudden, he sees these TV screens. And he knows the word Krakosia. He understands the visuals of this military coup, but that's about it. And so he's scared. He's terrified. And he's running around trying to find people who will help him, who will explain things to him, who will give him some amount of time to make his life easier. And most people ignore him. And in fact, a lot of people, they see him as being a nuisance. So as a result, especially in the early going, he has to fend for himself. And of course, that's precisely what you see in the context of the Nativity story. And so here's Mary and Joseph and obviously the child Jesus. And for the most part, people are indifferent. People don't care. No room in the inn, the flight to Egypt. They are immigrants. They are foreigners. Strangers in a foreign land, especially again when they go to the land of Egypt. And people don't see them. Here is holiness in their very midst, and they don't see them because they don't recognize Christ amongst the least of our brothers and sisters. And so, coincidence or not, as the movie progresses, you see people start to transform. And so, while again at the beginning of the film, people ignored Victor or otherwise were irritated by his presence, over time they come to realize that his presence is a blessing, a grace. And so, on some subconscious level, they recognize that it is truly Christ in their midst. And so it provokes them to a sense of generosity and goodness and outpouring of love. And that's why throughout the course of the film, even though there are certain people who respond with indifference and cruelty, a lot of people are spurred on to tremendous acts of generosity, culminating in this really beautiful moment where the chief security officer of the airport literally gives the shirt off his back to Victor before he finally goes out into the cold of New York City. Now that said, another theme which you find in the context of the movie, which again I was completely oblivious to back when I first saw this film, is a notion of waiting, a theme which is especially relevant when it comes to the Christmas season. And so again, when you go back to the Nativity story, certainly there are key events in the context of the narrative which really stand out. Moments like the Annunciation, the Visitation, the birth of the child Jesus, the flight into Egypt, that sort of thing. But at the same time, if you read between the lines, there are recurring moments of waiting to process the thing which has just happened, waiting to digest the particular words which have been said, waiting to decide what to do next, and waiting for God to simply come through, to make his presence and his love and his grace manifest in the midst of really difficult and challenging times. And again, this is precisely what you see in the context of the film. And so right off the bat, there's the obvious example of Victor Dvorsky waiting for a long period of time in the airport, waiting for his passport and ultimately waiting for permission to finally move from his current destination, to move from the airport lounge to go to Krakow or New York City. On top of that, this underlying theme of waiting is further supported by various subplots. And so, for example, every single day, Victor Dvorsky waits for hours on end to see this immigration officer who will almost certainly deny him access to the United States, even though he waits for the possibility, however slight, that this day might be different. He also befriends this baggage handler who's in love with the same immigration officer, and so basically he plays matchmaker between these two people. And even though within the hearts of these young people, there's this impatience, if you will, to know more, to meet finally in person, he encourages them, both of them, to wait until the appropriate time. He also becomes romantically involved with this flight attendant played by Catherine Zeta-Jones named Amelia Warner. And so obviously, given the nature of her job, there's recurring moments in the film where he must wait. He must wait for her to come back, for him to see her again, to have the opportunity, however brief and short, to be with each other, to spend quality time with each other. And in fact, in the midst of their many conversations, one of the things they talk about is precisely this. And so at a certain point in the film, Amelia makes the really insightful remark that all of us in a certain sense are waiting. We're waiting for something, but a lot of us don't know exactly what we're waiting for. But for me, the most striking example of this theme of waiting takes place at the end. And so at the end of the film, the war in Krakow is over. Victor can go back home, and he gets this emergency visa, which allows him to go to New York. And so he goes to New York, he goes to the Ramada Inn, he goes to this jazz club, and he runs into Benny Colson, this jazz musician for whom he wants to get the final signature for his father. And depending on how you look at it, the scene in question is both funny and profound. So just kind of picture the scene, right? So here's Victor. He's been living in an airport for basically 9 months, and he goes up to this guy and he says, look, my father, he was a huge fan of yours, and he really wanted to get the signature. So if you don't mind, sign this thing for my father. And he says these words with a certain tremor in his voice because, obviously, it's really emotional. But then what happens is that Benny Colson looks at him and he says, wow, a jazz fan, that's great. But you know what? We're about to start our set. So if you don't mind waiting, that'd be great. And so this invitation to wait yet again after all these things he's been through. But you see, what's interesting is that he's okay with it. And so once he's given this invitation again to wait yet again, there's a sense of resignation. Not bitterness, not any sort of negativity or suppressed anger, but contentment. Yes, this is right. And so he sits down, he allows them to play the set, and he listens to Benny Colson basically do his thing. He listens to Benny Colson play this amazing set of jazz music. It couldn't have been any other way, right? Like, I remember first watching this scene and being kind of annoyed at Benny Colson, like, just give the guy your signature, right? Don't you know how much he's been through? But, now, when I look back on this scene, it's the right thing to do. Like, even if Benny knew everything that Victor had gone through, it's the proper thing for Victor to sit down and listen to this guy do his thing, instead of simply getting the signature and leaving, because he wouldn't have had the opportunity to understand why this guy was so great, why he was so honored and cherished by his father. And so basically it was God's will for him to sit in this moment and take in this beautiful music, as opposed to simply getting the job done. And understanding this particular insight when it comes to waiting, it really helps to illuminate another scene in the movie, which really helps to kind of bring all these things together. So it's earlier in the film, and basically it's a conversation between Amelia and Victor, where Victor is telling Amelia for the first time the reason why he wants to go to New York. So all this business about the jazz musicians and the signatures and whatnot. And so basically Amelia turns to Victor And she says to him, "So you're doing all this for your father?" To which he says to her, "I think in a certain sense, he's doing it for me." And I think, friends, that particular line, that particular exchange, really helps to bring together all these different things we've been thinking about and pondering on when it comes to the subject of waiting. Because, quite honestly, I think whenever we experience any sort of tension or frustration when it comes to waiting, especially when it comes to our relationship with Christ, I think on some level we think that we're doing Christ a favor. Look at me, Lord, I'm waiting on you, I'm being patient with you, waiting for you to come through and do something finally. Whereas the reality is that God's presence, His love, these things aren't simply present when it comes to overt manifestations of supernatural grace, but they're also present when it comes to the waiting. And so even though many times it might seem like God is doing nothing because we can't see what He's doing or He's not actively involving us in the process, you always have to believe that God is always up to something, and that something is always good and glorious and amazing. And so therefore, whenever you find yourself in a period or a season even of prolonged waiting, realize that this time is very important. This time is not meant to be rushed. This time too is holy ground. And even though these moments might be difficult, challenging, even requiring a certain perseverance and faith, you're not so much doing God a favor. The benefit entirely, for sure, always incurs unto you. And may God bless you all.